The 0600 shift at Sacred Heart Hospital arrives like every other shift, fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical prayer, antiseptic sharp enough to strip the lining from your throat, the kind of silence that only exists in places where people are dying. Katie Rodriguez's hands are steady as she wipes down the nurse's station, movement efficient, practiced, the muscle memory of someone who's done this 1,000 times before. She moves through the hospital corridor like she belongs nowhere and everywhere at once. Her scrubs are navy blue, unremarkable. Her name badge reads simply K. Rodriguez, RN. Nothing else. Nothing that matters. The limp in her left leg is barely noticeable if you aren't looking for it, and most people aren't. A soft catch in her gait around the 3 p.m. mark when fatigue sets in, a slight favoring of her right side when she thinks no one's watching. The injury was never documented, never filed, never explained. That was part of the deal. When you disappear from certain kinds of records, you stay disappeared. The scar tissue underneath her left calf muscle is colloid and silvery, shaped like shrapnel, the kind of damage that comes from being close to an explosion but not close enough to die. She touches it sometimes, unconsciously, the way people touch crosses or worry stones, not prayer exactly but something adjacent to it. At 0555, before the rest of the day's shift begins their slow assembly into the break room, Katie opens her locker. The metal door swings on hinges that haven't been oiled in years. Inside, 3 changes of scrubs folded with military precision, a lunch container she never actually opens, a pair of compression socks, and at the bottom, hidden under a towel that's been there so long it's turned grey, a pair of combat boots. The leather is cracked from desert heat, the laces are frayed at the edges from sand that gets into everything in Baghdad, gets into your pockets and your hair and your lungs and never quite leaves. The toe box is scuffed. The heel is worn down on the left side more than the right, she favored her right leg even then. There's no identification on them. The tags were cut away years ago with a titanium scissors that Katie still owns, hidden in a kitchen drawer under a stack of takeout menus. The boots belong to someone who no longer exists. She doesn't pick them up. She never picks them up. She just opens the locker, touches them once with the flat of her hand, the way someone might touch a gravestone, and then she closes the door. It's a ritual. Rituals are what keep you tethered when everything else has been cut away. Rituals are proof that you're still here. At 0612, the first ambulance bay alarm sounds, 2 short bleeps, the sound of the automatic doors unlocking, voices raised in that particular cadence that means critical. Katie is already moving before she consciously registers the sound, her body standing before her brain catches up, because certain things don't require thinking anymore. The hospital corridor blurs. She passes the break room where 3 nurses are still pouring their first coffees, past the pharmacy window where Marcus Chen is organizing discharged medications, past the security desk where Officer Williams hasn't looked up from his phone in 12 minutes. The ER is a controlled chaos, every bed occupied or in the process of being occupied, every monitor beeping its own insistent rhythm, every foot pump hissing its quiet mechanical complaint. The patient arrives on a stretcher pushed by paramedics in the practice-synchronized stride of people who do this 40 times a week. They're calling out vitals in that machine gun staccato, stripped of emotion by repetition, GCS of 6, unresponsive, unknown mechanism of injury, no identification, no emergency contact, multiple contusions, suspected internal bleeding, arrived approximately 20 minutes ago, found unconscious in the stairwell of an abandoned warehouse near the port. The patient is male, military build even in catastrophic injury, unconscious and bleeding from a laceration above his left eye. His hands are calloused in specific places, webbing between thumb and forefinger, the sides of his palms, places where calluses come from handling ropes and fast roping down from helicopters and carrying rifles that weigh 30 pounds and never get lighter. Dr. Sterling is already there, which means he'd been waiting in the hospital at an hour when most human beings are still asleep. His shoes are Italian leather, the kind that cost more than a month of Katie's rent, and they click against the tile floor like a metronome counting down toward something. He's reviewing the chart with the expression of a man reading a balance sheet, calculating, running numbers in his head that have nothing to do with the person on the stretcher. His cologne arrives before his voice does, something expensive, something that smells like money and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. He's 48, with the kind of tan that only comes from golf courses in places where the sun never stops, and his eyes are the color of wet concrete. The new nurse can handle intake paperwork, he says without looking at Katie, the way he might say the same thing about a filing cabinet or a piece of equipment. It's not unkind exactly. It's worse than unkind. It's dismissive in that particular way that makes you understand, in a single sentence, that your existence is peripheral. Necessary, perhaps, but peripheral. He turns back to the patient, his eyes already calculating cost codes and insurance categories and which procedures will generate the highest reimbursement rates. Katie nods once. Of course, doctor. The words are deferential, carefully modulated, the voice of someone who has learned to take up less space. She moves toward the chart station, ready to begin the paperwork, the kind of administrative work that nobody notices unless it's done wrong. But her eyes don't move from the patient's neck. The scar is distinctive. Not the kind of scar you get from a car accident or a fall or the normal ways people acquire damage in civilian life. This is a burn pattern, specifically a shape that forms when a blast wave hits you at a precise angle, when the heat flash scalds the skin in a particular configuration, shaped like a question mark with the tail reaching toward the clavicle. Katie has seen this exact scar pattern exactly once before in her life. She has dreams about it sometimes, the kind where you wake up not knowing if you're screaming or not, where your heart is doing things it's not supposed to do, where your hands are shaking so hard you can't hold a pen. The memory arrives without warning, the way memories do when they've been suppressed for 20 years. She's not in Houston anymore. She's in Baghdad. She's 26 years old instead of 46. She's wearing desert camouflage instead of scrubs. The IED detonated in the basement of a 3-story residential building in the Jolan district, and the whole structure was coming down like a wave of concrete and rebar and dust so thick you couldn't see your own hands. She was supposed to be 2 blocks away. She heard a child screaming from inside the rubble pile, and all the training, all the protocol, all the careful instruction that says you follow orders and you don't deviate and you protect your team, all of that burned away in the time it takes to make a decision. She pulled a child out of that rubble. An 8-year-old boy with dark eyes and a burned scar on his neck shaped like a question mark, shaped exactly like the one on the patient in front of her right now. His name was Amora, and he screamed the whole time, screaming because the building was still coming down, screaming because the rotor wash from the helicopter was shaking loose more debris, screaming because he was 8 years old and his world was ending. She ran with him, and rounds pinged off the rubble around them, the particular sound of 7.62mm ammunition striking concrete, a sound that stays with you forever because your brain decides it's important for survival. She handed him to a Delta operator named Miller with a scar running through his left eyebrow, and she screamed coordinates, and she watched him get lifted away toward safety. After that, Katie Rodriguez ceased to exist in any official capacity. She never made it back to base. Her unit listed her as KIA. Her records were sealed. Her name disappeared from the roster. The 8-year-old boy was extracted with the rest of the hostages, processed through the system, disappeared into whatever programs the military uses to make people who shouldn't exist into people who definitely don't exist. That's what you do for someone who was classified. That's what you do for someone whose extraction might compromise ongoing operations. The patient's eye flickers. Just once. Not opening, not consciousness, but movement nonetheless, the kind of involuntary response that happens when the body is trying to fight its way back to awareness. Katie's breathing changes. It becomes shallow, controlled, the way soldiers breathe when they're trying not to cry or scream or let anyone know that their entire understanding of the world has just shifted on its axis. She's still holding the chart. She's still standing in the ER of Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston, Texas. She's still just the new nurse who handles paperwork. Dr. Sterling glances at her once, his eyes narrowing slightly. She's still there. She hasn't moved. Her expression hasn't changed. But he's the kind of predator who notices when something is off, the way a shark notices a disruption in water pressure, the way a snake notices vibration in the ground. He doesn't know what's wrong yet, but he's registered that something is different. The patient is moved to Trauma Bay 3, and Katie follows at a distance that seems professional but isn't, staying close enough to hear the vital signs being reported, close enough to see the 4 lines being established, close enough to watch the bandaging of the laceration above the patient's left eye. His left eye. The same side as the scar. 20 years ago, when she pulled him from the rubble, his eye was swollen shut from the blast, puffy and discolored and seeping blood. She couldn't tell if the eye itself was intact. She just ran. The Special Forces team arrives at 0847. For men, moving with that particular precision that comes from 1,000 hours of training together, from being the kind of unit where they finish each other's sentences and know what each person will do before they do it. They're wearing civilian clothes, jeans, running shoes, jackets that could be bought at any mall in America, but they move through the hospital like they own it, like the normal rules of civilian space don't quite apply to them. One of them, the tallest, with scar tissue around his right knuckles and eyes that have seen things that leave permanent changes in how you view the world, goes directly to Trauma Bay 3. The other 3 take up positions, one at the nurse's station, one by the elevator, one at the entrance to the trauma bay. They don't communicate with words. They just position themselves. Katie is at the chart station, ostensibly reviewing the John Doe's incoming documentation, the sparse paperwork that comes with a patient who has no identification and no next of kin. Found unconscious. Mechanism unknown. No witnesses. No context. No history. But her eyes keep moving back to the trauma bay, back to the patient's neck, back to the scar that's been burned into her memory for 2 decades. She opens the billing screen on the computer, something she's not supposed to do yet. The paperwork isn't officially processed, she's not authorized to access the coding system, but her fingers know the password because she memorized it 3 months ago when she started the job. The treatment codes are inflated. That's the first thing she notices. The patient is admitted as a general trauma case, but the codes assigned to his care are running 40% higher than standard protocol would support. Orthopedic consult that isn't documented. Neurosurgery consult that doesn't appear in any of the medical records. Lab work that was ordered but never actually completed. Each code strings another service onto the bill, each service gets reimbursed, and the reimbursement gets funneled somewhere that Katie's access level doesn't allow her to see. There's a pattern. There's always a pattern when money is being moved instead of healed. One of the Special Forces operators, the one with the scar tissue around his knuckles, makes eye contact with her across the ER. His eyes are the color of burnt sienna, and they're watching her with the precision of someone who's been trained to notice details. He sees her seeing him. He doesn't look away. Neither does Katie. For 5 seconds, just 5, they're locked in that gaze, and something passes between them, some understanding that doesn't require words. He knows that she knows something. She knows that he knows that she's the kind of person who notices things. The chart continues to fill out. The paperwork accumulates. The day shift moves forward with its mechanical necessity, bodies moving through the hospital, vital signs being recorded, medications being administered. Katie works through her shift with the careful efficiency of someone performing the role she's been cast in, the new nurse, the quiet one, the one who doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't make trouble and doesn't call attention to herself. She charts every 4 hours. She documents every observation. She keeps her distance from the trauma bay, visiting only when assigned, staying only as long as necessary. But her hand touches her left calf muscle 3 times during the shift, the scar tissue underneath her scrubs, the shape of something that should have destroyed her and didn't. At 16:30, when her shift is supposed to end, Katie doesn't leave. She stays at the station, organizing the incoming cases, updating charts, doing work that doesn't need to be done but requires her to remain in the hospital, remain near Trauma Bay 3, remain in the proximity of a patient who should be impossible but isn't. The evening shift arrives, different faces, different names, different people who don't know what she knows. They filter into their roles. The hospital continues. The monitors continue their electronic conversation with each other, one beeping in response to another, a rhythm that's been going on for years, that will continue after everyone in this room is gone. At 18:47, Dr. Sterling leaves through the main exit, his Italian shoes clicking one last time against the tile floor. His cologne lingers like a threat. Katie watches him go through the observation window, watches his BMW pull out of the parking lot, watches the evening settle over Houston like a heavy blanket. Only then does she allow herself to move. She steps into Trauma Bay 3. The patient is still unconscious. The monitors show vital signs that are stable for now, which means that the most dangerous time is the time nobody's paying attention to, the time when bodies are healing themselves in the darkness, when the damage continues even without the active injury. She stands at the foot of the bed. She looks at the scar on his neck. She looks at the hand resting on top of the blanket, and she sees the same calluses, the same shaped hands, older now but unmistakably the same person. 20 years is a long time to carry a name that doesn't belong to you anymore. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart Hospital began at 6:30, and Dr. Sterling moved through the ICU like a man who owned it. For residents trailed behind him in crisp white coats, 2 attending physicians flanked his sides, and the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical approval overhead. The ventilator wheezed its steady rhythm from the John Doe's room, the sound of a body being kept alive by machine, waiting to become someone again. Katie stood at the patient's bedside with her tablet, vitals logged, medications reconciled, the small routines that kept her invisible in spaces like this. She had worn the same scrubs 3 times that week, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would make people remember her face. The combat boot stayed in her locker, hidden behind old discharge folders and a jacket she never wore anymore. Muscle memory was a dangerous thing. Routine was safety. Dr. Sterling stopped at the foot of the bed, his stethoscope already in his ears before anyone had asked him to examine anything. His voice carried the pitch of a man accustomed to being listened to, not quite a question, more like an announcement dressed in doctor's confidence. So. Still no identification. Still no next of kin. He lifted the blanket, checked the patient's abdomen with the clinical detachment of someone cataloguing parts rather than healing people. Continue the current treatment protocol. Full workup on Monday. Blood cultures, repeat imaging, the works. Katie's eyes caught something as Sterling moved. The billing codes on the tablet screen. She'd noticed them yesterday, subtle things, the kind of discrepancies that most nurses learned to ignore because ignoring was easier than questioning, and questioning made you difficult, and difficult nurses didn't get good shifts or recommendations. But these weren't subtle to someone who had spent 18 years filing reports, reconciling resources, accounting for every single supply used in field medicine where inventory meant the difference between saving lives and losing them. Dr. Sterling. Her voice came out even, measured, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention but somehow commands it. The supply charges for this patient appear inflated. The coding shows 2 weeks of continuous wound vac therapy, but the patient's only been here 36 hours. The drainage bags haven't been changed. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a presence, something physical that settled on the resident's shoulders like weight. Sterling's eyes moved from the patient to Katie, and they narrowed, not the squint of someone thinking, but the contraction of a predator measuring distance. Nurse Rodriguez. He set down his stethoscope with deliberate precision. Perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone here why you believe your 2 months at Sacred Heart Hospital qualify you to question treatment protocols I've refined over 15 years of practice. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about men like Sterling. They didn't need to yell. The infrastructure of the hospital was already arranged in their favor. Katie took one measured breath. She didn't look away. She didn't soften her posture. The residents were watching now, she could feel their eyes sliding toward her like she was a specimen under glass, something to be catalogued and filed away. One of them, a young attending named Chen, actually shifted backward, a subtle repositioning that said everything about how survival worked in hierarchies like this. I'm asking about the coding, sir. Not the medicine. The codes don't match the treatment. Sterling stepped closer. His cologne, something expensive with notes of bergamot and old money, filled the space between them. Billing is not the concern of nursing staff, Ms. Rodriguez. That's what medical directors and hospital administrators do. What you do is take vital signs, hang medications, and follow the orders that people who actually have the training give to you. He paused. Let the words settle like sediment. Real doctors make these decisions. Not nurses who think they understand systems they've been trained explicitly not to understand. A single tear escaped Katie's left eye. Just one, just that, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that visible emotion was a weapon others could use against you. The residents watching probably thought it was fear. Maybe shame. They didn't know what restraint looked like when it was carved from the kind of composure that came from having survived things that would crack most people open like eggs. Sir, I've been erased from better records than yours. The words hung in the air like a fuse that had just been lit. Sterling's face flooded red, not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had switched a lever. His jaw tightened. The attending physicians exchanged glances that said they'd already calculated how this would look on internal reviews later. The resident stood frozen, waiting to see if he would escalate or retreat, and here was the thing about watching power dynamics unfold: everyone knew something had shifted, even if they couldn't name it yet. Get back to your station, Sterling said finally, his voice now sharp enough to cut through the hum of the ventilator. I don't want to see you near this patient's room again unless you're directly assigned to bedside care. Katie walked out without acknowledging the dismissal. She didn't nod. Didn't apologize. Just turned and moved back into the hallway where a young Special Forces soldier stood at parade rest, his eyes tracking her exit with the focus of someone trained to read rooms and predict outcomes. By lunchtime, the social architecture of Sacred Heart's ICU floor had reorganized itself around an unspoken agreement: Katie Rodriguez was now a liability. She entered the break room at noon, her meal in a plastic container: rice, steamed vegetables, grilled chicken that she'd prepped on Sunday in the quiet of her kitchen while Emma did homework at the table. Linda was there, the charge nurse who'd seemed friendly during orientation. And Marcus, who'd shown her where the extra blankets were stored. And Jen, who had actually smiled at her in the hallway yesterday. 3 people. All of them already gathering their things before Katie's foot fully crossed the threshold. Linda didn't make eye contact. She just stood, grabbed her lunch bag from the small refrigerator, and moved toward the door with the kind of synchronization that suggested they discussed this beforehand, a coordinated retreat that sent a message louder than any words could have managed. Marcus followed, his shoulders tense. Jen was last, and as she passed Katie, she muttered something just barely audible, not worth the association. The door swung shut. The break room hummed around Katie, the aging microwave, the fluorescent lights with their industrial buzz, the sound of rain beginning to tap against the small window that looked out onto the hospital's loading dock. She sat down at the plastic table and began to eat mechanically, each bite a small act of refusing to fall apart in public. Pain was information. Isolation was data. Numbers and facts, not emotions that could be weaponized. The notebook she kept in her locker, the one with the billing discrepancies documented in precise handwriting, dates and amounts and supply chain irregularities that painted a very clear picture of what Dr. Sterling was actually doing, suddenly felt like contraband. She'd been careful. Had she been careful enough? By Friday afternoon, the answer arrived on the unit bulletin board. The notice was printed on bright yellow paper, the kind used for warnings, for things that needed to be visible. Katie Rodriguez, unauthorized patient advocacy and insubordination, formal warning. There were boxes checked off with that bureaucratic finality that made everything official, everything permanent, everything part of a permanent record that would follow her like a scar. Sterling found her in the hallway outside the patient's room, where the 2 Special Forces soldiers maintained their rotation, one always present, one always alert. He handed her a copy of the write-up with fingers that stayed carefully wrapped around the edge, like he didn't want to be contaminated by direct contact. Maybe if you spent less time playing hero and more time following protocol, you'd understand why real doctors make these decisions. Charity case. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear, his voice dropping to the register of threats disguised as concern. You asked too many questions about veteran billing. That stops today. Am I clear? Katie took the paper and folded it once, a precise military crease, something that probably looked like nervous habit to anyone watching but was actually a command to herself, a way of compartmentalizing, of putting the anger into a container where it could be stored safely. Clear, sir. The Special Forces team leader, Captain's insignia, eyes that had seen things, watched the entire exchange. His radio crackled with static, and he pressed it to his ear, listened to something that made his expression shift, though his body language stayed completely still. He didn't say anything. Not to Katie. Not to Sterling. Just waited until the doctor had moved away down the hall, then looked directly at her with a gaze that felt like being scanned by equipment designed to see through walls. That evening, Sterling made 3 phone calls from his office on the 10th floor. The first was to Martin Reeves, chairman of the hospital board, who picked up on the second ring because Martin owed him from the time Sterling had helped sanitize records on a malpractice case that could have cost the hospital $1 million. "We have a problematic nurse," Sterling said, his voice smooth and measured, the sound of someone accustomed to having problems solved. "She's asking questions about billing practices. I'm concerned about her stability, her judgment. Frankly, I think she's a liability to the unit's reputation." The second call was to his brother-in-law, Derek Chen, who ran a medical supply company that had somehow managed to secure contracts with Sacred Heart despite bidding higher than every competitor. Sterling's voice was different in this conversation, more familiar, more casual. "Sanitize those records. The invoices from the past 6 months. The nurse from the floor, Rodriguez, she's asking questions. Nothing's going to happen, but let's be clean just in case." The third call was to a private investigator, a man named Garrett who'd been useful before in matters related to employee disputes. "Pull everything on Katie Rodriguez. Background, references, employment history, any gaps, anything unusual. I want to know who this woman is before Monday morning." When Garrett called back 3 hours later, his voice carried the tight precision of someone who'd found something that didn't fit neatly into standard categories. "Her references are sanitized. Sparse employment history with documented gaps. 2 separate identities showing up in some records, both with legal markers but dated differently. Whatever her background is, someone with resources went to considerable effort to make it clean." Sterling hung up the phone with a smile, the kind of smile that came from knowing you had leverage, from understanding that the next move was yours and the board would take your word over a nurse with gaps in her file, a woman with questions, a woman who didn't know the basic rules about staying invisible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Sterling didn't know, that the Special Forces soldier who'd watched the entire confrontation in the hallway had already called his team commander, that Captain Marcus Chen had already reported the interaction to his commanding officer at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, that the patient in the ICU bed had opened his eyes for exactly 3 seconds when Katie was checking his peripheral capillary refill, and in those 3 seconds, he had whispered a word that started a chain of phone calls that would not stop until the Pentagon itself took an interest in what was happening in the ICU at Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston. Katie got home at 7 o'clock that evening and found Emma at the kitchen table with her math homework spread out in front of her like a problem that had too many variables and not enough solutions. Her daughter looked up, and Katie saw the question forming before Emma even asked it. Something was wrong, something was different, something in her mother's face had shifted in a way that children could sense, like they were reading barometric pressure. "Hey, baby." Katie set down her bag and moved to the table, settling into the chair beside her daughter with the deliberate slowness of someone conserving energy. "How was school?" "Mrs. Chen gave us a math quiz. I got an A-." Emma was watching her carefully. "You're sad." Katie reached over and pulled her daughter close, breathed in the scent of her hair, kids' shampoo and playground dirt, and the ordinary miracle of being loved by someone who didn't yet understand all the ways the world was capable of breaking things. "Not sad, baby. Just a long day at work." What she didn't say, sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough. Sometimes it gets you erased. Sometimes the systems are designed so that people like you, people who ask questions, people who notice, people who remember, are the problem that needs to be solved. She held her daughter and helped with math problems and made dinner and read bedtime stories, and at 11 o'clock that night, she sat alone in her kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and a notebook full of charges that suddenly felt like evidence of something far larger than she'd understood when she'd first started documenting them. The rain had stopped. The city was quiet. Somewhere in an ICU bed, a patient who used to be 8 years old was still breathing with the help of machines, still waiting to tell his story, still waiting for someone to prove that the systems could be beaten, that even in a building as complex and layered and corrupt as Sacred Heart Hospital, truth could still emerge if someone was brave enough, or foolish enough, to look for it. The monitors sang their usual chaos on day 2. Katie moved through the ICU like she'd been doing this for 20 years in a hospital instead of 20 years everywhere else. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. Pause. The rhythm of a body held together by machines and luck. She was charting vitals at 0630 when she saw it, a subtle shift in the ST segment on the cardiac monitor. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that made alarms scream. Just a small flattening, a slight depression that most nurses would miss. Most nurses didn't have combat medic training. Most nurses hadn't spent 3 tours keeping soldiers alive in places where a monitor meant the difference between treatment and triage. She pulled up the previous strip from midnight. There it was again. A pattern. ST depression advancing with each passing hour like a slow-moving storm system. The intern would call it nothing. Sterling would call it monitoring artifact. Katie knew better. She continued her rounds, checking the Special Forces team member stationed by the door, a SEAL named Clayton who hadn't left the patient's bedside except to use the bathroom. Clayton watched her work. He didn't speak, but something in his eye shifted when she lingered longer than necessary over the cardiac monitor. She was placing her stethoscope on the patient's chest at 0745 when she heard it. A pericardial friction rub. A sound like 2 pieces of sandpaper moving against each other, barely audible beneath the ventilator noise. Not a typical heart murmur. Something else. Something worse. The kind of sound that meant fluid was accumulating in the space around the heart. The kind of sound that meant time was running short. Katie's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced, a corporal in Kandahar with a penetrating chest wound, fluid filling the pericardial sac, her fingers moving through that space with absolute precision while rounds pinged off the concrete. She documented everything in the patient's chart with the meticulous detail of someone who'd written field reports under fire. Day 2, 0745 hours, continued ST segment depression noted on serial cardiac strips. New finding, pericardial friction rub appreciated on auscultation, best heard at left fifth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Pattern consistent with pericarditis or early pericardial effusion. Recommend urgent cardiology consult and transthoracic echocardiogram to rule out pericardial tamponade. Clinical deterioration risk high without imaging confirmation. Rodriguez, RN. She flagged it in the system. Code yellow. Not emergency red yet, but urgent. Urgent enough that any competent physician would order an echo within the hour. Any competent physician would recognize that a patient with trauma to the chest who developed new cardiac symptoms needed imaging beyond the initial trauma scan. She found Dr. Sterling at 0830 in the break room, ordering coffee like he had all the time in the world. Katie approached with her hands open, her voice pitched low and deferential. Professional. Just a nurse with a question. Dr. Sterling, I flagged something in the John Doe's chart. ST changes and a friction rub. I think we need an echocardiogram to rule out pericardial involvement. Sterling turned slowly. His expression was the visual equivalent of a man listening to background music at a restaurant, present but not engaged. You think? He repeated the words like they were contaminated. The patient is stabilizing. Trauma scan was negative for significant pericardial fluid. Friction rub is probably from the ventilator irritation. Happens all the time. Katie breathed once. 2. Her jaw moved almost imperceptibly. The ST changes are progressive. That's not monitoring artifact. That's a pattern. Sterling set his coffee down with deliberate care. His eyes found hers, not a look of respect or consideration, but something colder. You're a nurse, Ms. Rodriguez. You monitor. You document. You don't diagnose. I understand you're new, eager to impress, maybe trying to prove you belong here. But ordering unnecessary imaging on patients with inflated treatment codes is how we lose contracts with insurance carriers. The words landed like a professional assassination. Efficient. Quiet enough that no one else in the break room would hear it. Loud enough that she would feel it. The echo will clarify his status, Katie said, her voice unchanged. Not a request. A statement. An opinion. I've already cleared it with administration. I make the clinical decisions on my cases. Not you. Sterling picked his coffee back up. What part of that didn't penetrate? Katie turned and walked out of the break room. Her hands were empty. Her face was expressionless. But the memory of that friction rub was etched in her chest like a scar. She could hear it even now, the sound of tissue damage becoming cardiac emergency, the sound of time counting down. The disciplinary write-up appeared on the unit board at 1,100 hours. Katie saw it alongside shift assignments and infection control reminders. Her name. Unauthorized patient advocacy and insubordination. Failure to maintain appropriate nurse-physician hierarchy. Creating hostile work environment through repeated questioning of clinical decisions. Sterling's signature at the bottom in blue pen. Clinical and final. She pulled it from the board without expression and walked to his office. He was waiting. He'd been waiting. That much was clear from the way he looked up from his desk without surprise, like he'd been anticipating this conversation and had prepared for it the way a hunter prepares for a cornered animal. You wanted to talk, he said. It wasn't a question. Katie set the write-up on his desk with precise placement. Center. Aligned. This is retaliatory. We both know that. Sterling leaned back in his chair, which squeaked under his weight like a small animal in distress. This is documentation of a pattern. 3 separate instances in 48 hours where you've attempted to override physician judgment. That's a fireable offense at most hospitals. Be grateful I'm giving you a chance to improve. Katie stood with her shoulders back and her hands at her sides. Her voice dropped. Not from fear. From absolute clarity. From the kind of calm that comes when you've already survived the worst the world can offer and found yourself still standing on the other side. I've been erased from better records than yours. The words came out soft enough that Sterling almost missed them. But he didn't miss them. He heard them, and something in his face shifted, a flicker of uncertainty, like he'd just realized that the woman standing in his office wasn't quite who he'd been assuming. That there was depth beneath the compliant surface. That he might have miscalculated. Sign it, he said, pushing the paper toward her. If you're going to continue working here, you acknowledge receipt and accept the corrective action. Katie picked up the pen from his desk. She held it over the signature line. Her hand was steady. Rock steady. The kind of steady that comes from having held a scalpel over a femoral artery in a collapsing building. She signed her name with deliberate care. Not the signature of someone defeated. The signature of someone who was choosing her moment, choosing her ground, choosing not to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she looked up at Sterling, there was one moment where her eyes made direct contact with his. One moment where the mask of deference slipped just enough for him to see something else looking back at him. Not fear. Not anger. Just recognition. The recognition of someone who'd been underestimated by people with far more authority and had survived them all. A single tear traced her cheek. Not from defeat. Not from shame. From something deeper. From 20 years of holding it together. From the weight of being one person in 2 worlds and never quite fitting in either. She didn't wipe it away. She let it sit there, visible, while she maintained eye contact with Sterling. While she breathed. While she made him watch her choose dignity over collapse. "I'll send the echo request through proper channels," she said. "Is there anything else, Doctor?" Sterling's face had gone the color of old paint. He looked away first. That was the real victory. Not the words. Not the refusal to break. The fact that he looked away first. Katie left his office and returned to the unit floor. The monitors continued their beeping symphony. The ventilator continued its mechanical breathing. And somewhere in the ICU, the patient who used to be 8 years old was beginning to wake up, was beginning to remember a voice that had pulled him from the rubble 20 years ago, was beginning to understand that miracles sometimes take 2 decades to manifest. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was happening right now, at 1,145 hours, on the monitors that Katie continued to watch with the absolute attention of someone whose entire career was about to depend on seeing what others missed. The worst part was that Sterling was right about one thing, that the patient was stabilizing. The worst part was that the monitors were about to stop lying, were about to tell the real story, the story that would force everyone to choose a side. And Katie was out of time to prepare them for the truth. The monitors stopped lying at 0700 hours on day 3. Katie saw it first, the subtle shift in the rhythm, the way the pressure curve flattened like a dying heartbeat drawn on paper. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins standing out like guitar strings against pale skin. Blood pressure dropping in real time, 110 to 105 to 98, the numbers sliding downward with the precision of a countdown clock. Pericardial tamponade. The sac around the heart filling with blood, squeezing the organ with every beat, suffocating it from the inside out. No one had seen the fragment on imaging. Sometimes the smallest pieces did the most damage. Dr. Sterling stood at the monitor station, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Katie was already moving, muscle memory taking over, her hands reaching for the supplies before her brain finished processing the diagnosis. She'd done this before, not in a hospital with fluorescent lights and protocols and review boards watching every decision, but in conditions where hesitation meant body bags and helicopters couldn't land because of hostile fire. Pain was information. Blood pressure was a message. And right now, every sensor in the room was screaming the same word, now. Sterling's phone was already in his hand, his voice climbing an octave. Cardiothoracic. I need cardiothoracic surgery in here, stat. Etta. His words scattered like startled birds. His competence had evaporated the moment the crisis became real, the moment it stopped being something he could manage with phone calls and political favors and instead became something that required actual hands and actual knowledge. The difference between a surgeon and someone who played one in the daylight. Katie prepped the needle with movements that belonged to someone else entirely, someone from a lifetime ago. 18-gauge catheter. Sterile field. She located the xiphoid process, the bottom of the breastbone, and the 5th intercostal space, her fingers finding landmarks on the John Doe's chest like reading Braille in the dark. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, angling toward the left shoulder, steady as a surgical laser. 1 breath. 2. The resistance changed. She was in. The hiss of air escaping. 60 cubic centimeters of dark blood filled the syringe. Not bright red blood, not fresh, old blood, sitting, cooking, suffocating the heart one squeeze at a time. She withdrew the needle with the same precision, and the monitors responded like they'd been waiting for permission to live again. Oxygen saturation climbed. 72 to 78 to 85. The cardiac waveform straightened, morphed from the collapsed diastolic collapse back into something that resembled a heartbeat. Sinus rhythm. The beautiful, ordinary rhythm of a man coming back from the edge. The John Doe's eyes opened. Not a flicker. Not a drowsy awareness. Full consciousness, eyes focusing on her face with the clarity of someone who'd been somewhere dark and just remembered how to navigate toward light. 3 seconds of eye contact. His lips moved. No sound at first. Then, raspy and hollow through the endotracheal tube, one word, Reaper. Katie's hands trembled. She pulled the needle free and stepped back, the autopilot still running, the professional mask still in place, but something had fractured inside her chest. Reaper. A call sign from 20 years ago. A name she'd been ordered to forget, buried deeper than any grave, filed under classified and then burned. A name that belonged to someone who'd extracted hostages and toppled networks and existed in the margins of official history where operations never happened and soldiers were declared dead to protect secrets that would outlast them all. The SEAL team leader heard it. Katie saw his head turn, saw his eyes find hers across the room, saw the moment recognition washed over his face like a wave hitting a seawall. The kind of recognition that rewrites the past tense into present tense, that turns rumors into confirmation, that changes everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Dr. Sterling's face went white. Then red. His coffee cup hit the floor and shattered, the sound of porcelain breaking like small bones, splashing brown liquid across the linoleum in a pattern that looked almost like blood spatter. His mouth opened and closed like a fish dying in air, and Katie understood in that instant that he'd just realized what he'd done. Not the fraud, not the billing scheme, not the inflated codes that had been flowing through his account like poison through a vein. He'd just realized he'd tried to break someone who'd already been broken and remade by institutions far more powerful than Sacred Heart Hospital. He moved toward the door. Phone in hand. The expressions on his face cycling through rage and panic and calculation, the look of a man trying to figure out which of his carefully built networks to activate first. Which alliance to call? Which powerful contact owed him a favor large enough to bury this? He made 4 calls. The first to Martin Reeves, the board chair who owed him from a malpractice case 3 years ago, voice urgent and clipped, she performed a procedure outside her scope. Liability nightmare. Termination. Today. The second to the Texas Medical Board, the words rushed and official, formal complaint. RN Katie Rodriguez. Practicing medicine without a license. Incident at 0703 hours this morning. The third back to the private investigator whose retainer he'd paid, I don't care what it costs. Find something. Anything. Prior incidents, dismissals, complaints. I want ammunition. The fourth to hospital security, prepare termination paperwork. Effective immediately. At 1,500 hours, they came for her. Security approached the nurse's station where Katie was charting, still in scrubs, still professional, still wearing the mask that had become so familiar she'd almost forgotten it was a mask. The guard, the same one who'd nodded at her in the break room for 6 months, who'd let her use the staff bathroom without asking, wouldn't make eye contact. Ms. Rodriguez, collect your personal belongings. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You have 10 minutes. She moved like she'd been expecting this, because some part of her had been. She'd known the moment she'd put the needle in that the carefully constructed fiction of her life at Sacred Heart would collapse. You couldn't save someone from the past without the past catching up to you. You couldn't pull a drowning man from the water without getting wet. Her locker smelled like antiseptic and time. She opened it and pulled down the pair of worn combat boots from the top shelf, scuffed desert tan leather, the sole of the left one coming slightly loose, the laces still tied from the last time she'd worn them 18 years ago. She placed them in the cardboard box someone had provided, careful as if they were made of glass. Her name tag went in next. A photo of Emma, her 10-year-old daughter, caught mid-laugh at a carnival, cotton candy blue in her hair. Her scrub cap with a tiny embroidered nurse's insignia that meant nothing now. The security guard walked with her to the front desk. His hand shook as he reached for her hospital badge. She held it out, watched him position the security scissors, industrial grade, the kind used to cut through trauma shears and for tubing, and bring them down in one clean motion. The plastic snapped. He did it again. The badge split in half, the photo of her face divided between the 2 pieces. He let them fall into the trash without meeting her eyes. 30 staff members watched from various stations. No one moved. No one spoke. Katie understood that, in that moment, she'd become invisible. Not erased, invisible. The kind of absence that happens when an institution decides someone no longer exists within its walls. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any goodbye. She carried the cardboard box through the main lobby, past the admission desk where visitors checked in with clipboards, past patients waiting in chairs, past the volunteer at the information kiosk who'd always smiled at her and now looked away. The Houston afternoon hit her like a physical thing when she pushed through the automatic doors, heat shimmering off the parking lot, the smell of exhaust and asphalt baking in the Texas sun, the weight of humidity pressing down like a hand on her chest. She drove home with no radio, no traffic updates, no distraction. Just the sound of the engine and her own breathing and the cardboard box rattling slightly in the passenger seat. 43 minutes. No tears. Not yet. The thing about military training was that it taught you to compartmentalize, to set down the emotional debris and deal with survival first, feelings later. But Katie was running out of room in the compartments. She arrived at 1,515 hours. 2 hours before dinner should have been ready. 2 hours before Emma's homework was supposed to be done and the kitchen was supposed to smell like something warm and alive instead of like the absence of those things. Emma was at the kitchen table, worksheet in front of her, her small face scrunched in concentration. Third-grade math, simple fractions, the kind of problem that would take 5 minutes and then her daughter would forget it forever. She looked up when she heard the door close, and Katie watched her daughter's expression shift from "Hello, Mom" to something else. Something confused. Something that understood, at 6 years old, that people didn't come home at this time. People didn't come home carrying cardboard boxes. "Mom? Why are you home?" Katie set the box down on the counter. She sat across from her daughter at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd had breakfast that morning, where Emma had asked about going to the mall this weekend, where the world had been ordinary and whole. She opened her mouth to speak and the compartments gave way. All of them at once. The tears came like a dam breaking, 18 years of them, the kind that don't make noise because they come from somewhere deeper than breath. Her shoulders shook. Her hands shook. Emma's eyes went wide with fear, a fear that was worse than any injury, any illness, anything a child could witness in a hospital. The fear of watching a parent break. Emma was around the table in seconds, her small arms around Katie's neck, her voice high and tight. "Mommy, what's wrong? Mommy, what happened?" Katie held her daughter and tried to find words that would explain how doing the right thing could destroy everything. How saving someone could cost everything else. How you could spend your life invisible, wearing borrowed identities, following orders into the darkness, and then one moment of recognition could bring the entire structure of your carefully built life down like a house made of glass. "Mommy made a mistake, baby," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough." Emma didn't understand. Katie couldn't explain, not the combat boots in the box, not the procedure she'd performed, not the word Reaper or what it meant or what it would cost to have spoken it aloud in a room full of witnesses. She could only hold her daughter and wonder if saving a boy from the rubble 20 years ago had been worth ending up here, at a kitchen table in Houston, unemployed and exposed, and watching her daughter's small face try to understand why the world had suddenly shifted beneath them. The phone rang at 1900 hours. The phone rang at 1900 hours exactly. Katie's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the kind of restraint that comes from holding everything together for too long. She didn't answer. She let it ring 3 times while Emma watched from the kitchen doorway, her small face a mirror of her mother's exhaustion. On the 4th ring, Katie picked up. The voice on the other end was clipped, military precise, introducing herself as Captain Richards, Naval Special Warfare Command. "Is this Catherine and Rodriguez?" "Not Katie." "Nom." The full name. The one from another life. Katie's jaw tightened. She'd been erased from records so thoroughly that hearing her full name spoken aloud felt like a door opening in a sealed room. "Speaking. We need to talk about Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen. He's awake. He's asking for you by your call sign. And the Pentagon would like to know why a Navy SEAL's medical records show a pericardiocentesis performed by a registered nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital when the procedure was listed as performed by Dr. James Sterling. The kitchen went perfectly silent. Emma held her breath. Katie exhaled slowly. Dr. Sterling wasn't in the room when the patient crashed. "We know," Captain Richard said. "We've known for approximately 4 hours. The FBI has been investigating Sacred Heart's billing practices for 8 months. Your questions about inflated treatment codes were the anomaly that confirmed their fraud pattern. You may have just handed us the evidence we needed to close this investigation. There's a call coming to your hospital administrator in 30 minutes. I wanted you to know first." The line went dead. Katie lowered the phone. Emma stepped forward and took her hand. "Mommy." "Change of plans, baby," Katie whispered. Everything just changed. The call to Helen Moss, Sacred Heart's chief administrator, came at 19:30 hours. By 2015, the FBI field office in Houston had established a direct line to the hospital's legal department. By midnight, subpoenas were moving. Bank records were being pulled. The private investigator Sterling had hired to fabricate evidence against Katie was being contacted and offered immunity for cooperation. By 0600 the next morning, black SUVs lined the parking lot in front of Sacred Heart Hospital, and the entire institutional machinery that had expelled Katie Rodriguez 48 hours earlier began turning in the opposite direction with terrifying momentum. The conference room on the 7th floor filled slowly. Helen Moss sat at the head of the table, her face the color of someone watching her institution collapse in real time. The hospital's board chair, Martin Reeves, kept checking his phone. The Texas Medical Board representative sat with a leather portfolio. The FBI special agent in charge, a woman named Holloway with eyes that had seen every form of institutional corruption, arranged documents in careful stacks. Captain Richard stood in dress uniform by the window. 3 SEAL team operators occupied the far wall in civilian clothes, their posture identical, spine straight, hands resting on their thighs, the kind of stillness that comes from training your body to wait for violence. And in the center of the room, propped upright with a Navy corpsman attending, sat a man Katie hadn't seen in 20 years. His eyes found hers the moment she entered. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen, meet your surgical team," Captain Richard said. The formality was deliberate. Marcus's voice came out rough from the ventilator tubes, but clear. "Rodriguez. Senior Chief." The room shifted. Katie's spine straightened by 3 millimeters. She didn't speak. The Navy captain slid a personnel file across the table. Katie's hands didn't shake as she picked it up. Inside, her photograph from 2004, her full name, her service record. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Another Silver Star, this one classified, the mission in Baghdad where she'd extracted 7 hostages including an 8-year-old boy, under sustained fire, through a collapsed building where rounds were pinging off the rubble like hail. Her call sign, Reaper, was listed alongside commendation letters that had been redacted so heavily they looked like black bars. Katie Rodriguez served 13 years in naval special warfare, the SEAL team leader said. His name tape read Holloway. His voice carried the weight of command, not loud, just precise. 2 Silver Stars. 1 for direct extraction of multiple hostages under fire in Baghdad, 2004. 1 for a classified direct action mission that prevented compromise of a CIA asset network spanning 3 countries. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. Katie Rodriguez was declared killed in action to protect an ongoing operation that your politicians decided never happened. The room didn't move. The FBI agent, Holloway, allowed herself a small smile. The patient you see here, Holloway continued, became a Green Beret because an American service member told him he mattered. He became a SEAL because he wanted to become that service member. He became Senior Chief because Katie Rodriguez taught him what leadership looks like. She maintained operational security for 15 years while working as a civilian. She raised a daughter alone. She started over with nothing. Never once broke cover, even when it cost her everything. He paused. That's what a real warrior looks like. The FBI special agent in charge spread bank records across the table like a dealer laying out cards. Dr. James Sterling has systematically defrauded Veteran Services billing of $2,300,000 over 18 months, Holloway said. These funds flowed through his brother-in-law's medical supply company, charges for equipment that was never ordered, never delivered, never existed. Consulting fees paid directly to Sterling. Equipment kickbacks that cycle back into Sterling's personal accounts. The pattern holds across 847 veteran patients at Sacred Heart. Katie's questions about the John Doe's inflated treatment codes, $40,000 in 3 days, were the anomaly that confirmed the entire scheme. Dr. Sterling's private investigator, sitting under subpoena with his attorney, confirmed the rest in a flat voice. Dr. Sterling hired me to fabricate evidence against Ms. Rodriguez. I'm cooperating fully with federal authorities. Martin Reeves, the hospital board chair, began sweating visibly. He knew what was coming. The Texas Medical Board representative spoke next. Dr. James Sterling, your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending criminal investigation. Sterling's phone buzzed. Then again. Then continuously. His brother-in-law calling. His attorney. His wife. He stared at the table and didn't reach for it. Captain Richards turned to Helen Moss with the careful respect of someone addressing a superior officer. Senior Chief Rodriguez's termination is void. Her actions on day 3 saved the life of a decorated combat veteran using medical skills she acquired in direct service to this country. The pericardiocentesis was performed by one of the most highly trained combat medical specialists in Naval Special Warfare Command history. Your institution fired a Navy SEAL to protect a criminal. Helen Moss's face had moved through shock into something harder. She found her spine the way people do when institutional survival is on the line. Dr. Sterling, you are terminated for cause, effective immediately. Security will escort you from this building. Ms. Rodriguez, you are reinstated with full back pay and a formal public apology from this institution. She paused. Additionally, we're creating a position. Director of Veteran Services. If you're interested. Katie didn't respond immediately. She was watching Marcus, who was watching her with the expression of someone who'd just seen a ghost resolve into flesh. The same boy she'd pulled from the rubble. The man he'd become. The debt that lived between them. Security arrived, the same guard who'd escorted Katie out with a cardboard box, whose name tag read James, a veteran himself with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen what corruption does to the people it claims to serve. He approached Sterling with another cardboard box, identical to the one he'd carried for Katie. His voice was flat, professional, ice beneath the surface. Dr. Sterling, your personal belongings. I believe you know the way out. Sterling stood on legs that didn't quite remember how to work. He took the box. He walked through the same lobby Katie had walked through yesterday, past 30 staff members who watched in perfect silence. No one spoke to him. The automatic doors closed behind him like a seal on a tomb. The next 6 months moved like a timeline. Federal charges brought conspiracy and fraud convictions. 8 years in minimum security. Eligible for parole in 5. Sterling's wife divorced him. His brother-in-law turned state's evidence. The last Katie heard, he was out on bail pending appeal, selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall on Highway 6, approaching strangers in parking lots with the desperation of a man who'd lost everything. Katie's office on the 7th floor had a window overlooking Houston. The combat boot sat on the shelf behind her desk, polished now, tags still cut away, visible to everyone who entered. Emma sometimes came after school and took them down just to hold them, running her fingers over the worn leather like she was learning her mother's real history through her hands. Master Sergeant Marcus Chen, Green Beret now, recovered fully and returned to his unit, but he stopped by Sacred Heart every few weeks. He'd walk to Katie's office, see the boots on the shelf, and they'd sit together in silence for 10 or 15 minutes because some debts live beyond words. He told her once, his voice rough, "You gave me a second life in Baghdad. I was returning the favor by almost dying here." She laughed, the first real laugh in years, and for a moment the weight she carried shifted slightly lighter. The SEAL team sent a plaque to Senior Chief Rodriguez. Some warriors wear uniforms. Some wear scrubs. All stand the watch. It hung beside the boots. This is Katie's story, but it's also the story of every quiet warrior walking the halls of hospitals and clinics across this country, fighting battles no one will ever fully understand, saving lives in the dark when no one's watching. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever stood up for what's right and paid the price, if you've ever known someone carrying invisible scars, subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments. Because these stories matter. They matter because they're real.